So this is the this is the lab over bone tissue, and we're going to also cover a bone model, and also we're going to look at classification of bones. So again, this is a little bit of a repeat, a reinforcement of what we did in lecture this morning. So we're going to kind of move through it fairly quickly. If you have any questions, though, please just ask them, and we'll stop if we need to and repeat if we need to, and so on. So this morning we talked about how you classify bones, and remember there's three ways to classify bones. So one is by position or location, one is by shape, and one is by type. So with position, remember, sometimes these are called divisions, and if you look at this skeleton, you can see the two divisions. There's this green one here, that's one division, and then there's sort of the tan one, that's another division. And the two divisions, one of them is the axial skeleton. And the axial skeleton includes the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. And if you count all of those bones, it's 80 bones. And so when we look at it, again, 80 bones. And so those are, again, the bones of the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. And then the other division is this appendicular division. And the appendicular division is the two girdles. There's a girdle right here called the pectoral girdle, and there's a girdle right here, which is called the pelvic girdle. And then the arms and hands, and then the legs and feet. And so that is the appendicular skeleton. And if you count those bones, it's 126. So as we said before, if you add these two together, there are 206 named bones in the adult. So I mentioned that children have more bones, and they do. Depending on how old you are, it's about 300 bones in children. But what happens is we get fusion of bones. And so if you look at the hips for children, this bone right here is actually 3 bones. So there's one here, there's one back here, and there's one here. And so instead of it being one bone like it is in an adult, it's 3, but they fuse together. So 3 becomes 1. And same thing on the other side, 3 becomes 1. And so there's a lot of fusion that happens. And so as that happens, the number of bones goes down. So we go from about 300 down to 206. Another way to classify bones, remember, is by shape. And so we went through and we talked about long bones. We looked at long bones. Remember, long bones are hollow in the middle. And then short bones. Short bones are the little bones of the wrist and the little bones of the ankle. And if you open them up, they're not hollow in the middle. There's a thin layer of this dense bone on the outside, and they have spongy bone in the middle. And then we have flat bones. And flat bones, same way. They look a little bit like this. They have these thin plates of dense bone, and then spongy bone in the middle. So there's no big hollow space in either one of these. Irregular bones are just called that because they don't fit into the other categories very well. If you look at this bone, this is a vertebra. And if you look at a vertebra, it has this part. That looks like a short bone. It's not, but it looks like one. And then it's got these things sticking off like this. And if you look at that, that looks like a flat bone. Again, it's not, but it looks like one. And so it's got combinations of these. And so it makes it really hard to describe. They have complicated shapes. And so these are just called irregular. And so irregular bones are all of the vertebrae, but they're also the hip bones. Those are irregular bones. And in some books, the shoulder blade, which we'll see back here, is called an irregular bone. That shoulder blade, the name of that bone is the scapula. So in some books, the scapula is considered an irregular bone. In some books, the scapula is considered a flat bone. So it just depends on which author you believe or which author you are reading as to what you might see. Now I think your book, our book, calls it a flat bone. And so that's what we're going to use. But neither one of those would be incorrect. And then we have those that are called special. Remember, they don't fit in any category. And another thing that's weird about them is they vary in number. So some people have very few of them, some people have more. And then they only found in certain locations. They're found in special places. So one of the places they can be found is between the joints of the skull. So here are the joints of the skull, and those joints are called sutures. So these are called sutural bones. And so if you look at this bone right here, that is not normal. That is not the way most people's sutures are. Most people's sutures look like this over here. But look, that's a little island of bone that's located inside the suture. So it's a separate little bone. And here's another one right next to it. It's a separate little bone. And so these little separate little bones, these little islands of bones, are these sutural bones. And then we also have these bones called sesamoid bones, which comes from the word sesame seed. And that's kind of what they look like. They look like sesame seeds. And so if you look at some tendons, the more you use it, the more likely it is this to happen. You get little bones developing in them. How many of you have ever been to the state fair and you've gotten a turkey leg? You know, the turkey leg that looks like this and you eat it? Well, if you eat a turkey leg, what you're going to find out is it feels like there are these long, skinny bones in there, but they're not bones. They're tendons. And because turkeys are so heavy and their entire body weight is on these two legs, these tendons develop these bones in them. And the bones actually are so many of them, they're end to end to end, that this tendon almost feels like it's solid bone, even though it's not. And so it has these sesamoid bones in it. Humans also have sesamoid bones. We don't have that many, but we have some. And one of the places you have them is here, where the big toe attaches to the foot. Another place is the thumb attaches to the hand. And then the third way to classify bones is by type. And there's two types of bone. There's dense bone and spongy bone. So here's dense bone, here's spongy bone. Well, if we were in the lab, we would be looking at this model right now. So this is a three-dimensional plastic model. And if we look at it, it's also got dense bone. Here it is right here. And spongy bone. Here it is right here. Because what this model is a sort of a wedge that was taken out of a bone. So look, right here, they took a wedge out. And then they blew the wedge up and they made a made a model out of it. So this is the outside of this model. And this is the inside of this model. So if we look at the outside, it's right here. And the inside is right next to this spongy bone, which we're going to see. So when we look at this model, all of this is dense bone. But right here, that's spongy bone. And then we look at the structure of a long bone. So remember, long bone has this sort of hollow-like long sort of tube structure, which is called the diaphysis. And then it has these ends which are wider, but they're not hollow. They have these little tiny spaces of spongy bone in there, and those are called epiphyses. So if you look at this, this is a femur, this is a thigh bone, and here's the diaphysis from here to here. And here's one epiphysis here, and here's the other epiphysis here. Well, we need to be able to differentiate these, and so we use the words proximal and distal. So remember, proximal means closer to, so this is closer to the trunk. So in this case, which is an upper arm bone, this would be the shoulder. And this would be the elbow down here. Here, this would be the hip. Down here would be the knee. So the area that's closer to the shoulder, closer to the hip, is proximal. And the area that's closer to the elbow, closer to the knee, is distal. And so we're going to have each of these. And then remember, if you cut it open, what you're going to see is a big hollow space, which is called the medullary canal or medullary cavity. Well, in this picture, you can see that there's even spongy bone in here. That's spongy bone. And remember, you can see spongy bone with your naked eye. You don't have to have a microscope to see it. So it looks like this. Also, don't forget it in these spaces, we have marrow. And there's two types of marrow. Remember, there's red and there's yellow. So this is a picture that's in the lab book, and you can see what this long bone looks like. Here's where the marrow is. And so if you're a child, it's mostly red marrow. But as you get older, what happens is the red gets replaced with yellow. And by the time you're an adult, it's mostly yellow. And you remember, yellow is fat. So Zoe says the marrow is red. Well, no, they both are alive. It's just different tissue. Red bone marrow is tissue that produces blood cells. So think about this. An infant or a little child is growing like crazy, and their amount of their blood is growing too. And so they need to be able to have lots of space making these blood cells. But when you reach an adult, it pretty much sort of slows down so that the number that you grow is the same as the number you lose. And so we need less red bone marrow. So we still have it, there's just less of it. And what gets replaced is fat. So where we're no longer using it anymore, that turns into yellow marrow. And if you look at the ages down here, you can see what it kind of looks like. And again, this bone is the femur. This is the hip bone. But it's pretty characteristic of what all long bones look like. And then remember, we have these two different types of bone. We have dense, which is also called compact, and we have spongy, which is also sometimes called cancellous. I don't know very many people who use that term, but it's still sometimes used. But if you look at the bone under a microscope, this is what it looks like. Here's dense, and here's spongy. And so it gives you kind of a good idea. Dense is very tightly packed. It's hard. It's dense. Spongy, though, look, has all these spaces in between it. And so it looks a lot like a sponge or maybe sort of a honeycomb. And what we see are these ridges, and these ridges are called trabeculae. So we're going to look at these two types of bone. So let's look at dense bone first. So here's what dense bone looks like under a microscope. But remember, this is dead bone. We talked about it in histology. It's dead. Someone dug it up out of a grave or something like that, and they ground it down until it was paper thin, and then remember, they poured ink on it. And so everywhere that you see dark, that is ink. So look, there's ink here and ink here, but also in these little places here, all of this in these little lines. And so those are all spaces. Well, in dead bone, they're empty. But in living bone, which looks like this, there's stuff in there. There's blood vessels in there, there's nerves in there, there's all kinds of cells in there, and you can see them over here. All of that is living bone. So living bone has a ton of blood vessels. And this bone over here, though, the blood vessels have all gone away. So here's dead bone versus living bone. They look very similar, but look, this is just an empty space right here. There's nothing in it. But here, when you look at it, it's got an artery, a vein, and a nerve. These are empty space right here. But when you look in here, this is where the cells are. And then if you look in here, this is empty space, little tiny cracks. But here, what's going through here are those cytoplasmic extensions that allow the cells to connect with each other. Can everybody see the difference between dead bone and living bone? So we're back to dead bone again. Remember, it looks a lot like a tree that's been cut down, or a bunch of these trees. Every single tree, every stump, is called an osteon. And an osteon is the unit of bone. It's the smallest unit of bone. And so when you look at it, it's got these different parts. It has a central canal, it has lamellae, it has these little spaces called lacunae, and that's where the cells are. But Priscilla, yes, this is dead. So there are no cells in here. They've all rotted away. These are just empty spaces. Remember, they're the spaces where the cells are located. But when this thing dies, that's empty. That's gone. But again, here's this dry bone, dead bone, and you can see the different parts. So here's where the blood vessels were, and that's called the central canal. Here's where the cells were, and that's called the lacunae. And the cell that was in there was called an osteocyte. Here are these layers, and the layers are called lamellae. And then these little tiny, tiny canals where they extend their little processes through are called canaliculi. So when you look at that, you should be able to pick that out on any slide. So if we go back one slide, you still should be able to pick it out. If you go back to the other slide, you still should be able to pick it out. So you should be able to label these parts here. And then also here too. But remember, this shows a living bone. So if we were alive, this is what it would look like. And look, there are a lot of blood vessels in bone. Lots of them. Bone is highly vascularized. Lots of blood vessels. Well, they all come from a single blood vessel here, and then they divide, and they go up, and they go down, they go up, and they go down. Well, if they go through tunnels that run long ways, like here's long ways on the bone, this is long ways. These are called central canals. But there are also these which run across the bone like this. If they run across the bone, they're called perforating canals. And so you can see that blood vessels run through those. Well, we can see that on the model too. So what we're looking at with this model is a superior view. This is the top of the model. So we're looking down on it. And what we see are a bunch of osteons. So look, there's an osteon. There's another one. There's another one. There's another one. These are all osteons. Even this is an osteon and this, but what's happened here is they've telescoped it out so you can see the individual lamellae. So it's not cut flat. They're telescoped out because this is what it looks like. It's tube within tube within tube within tube. And you see it here. So here's that top view right here. And there's our osteon. There's our osteon. Remember, there's always a blood vessel in the middle. That's called the central canal. There's the central canal. But this is also a central canal, and this is also a central canal. And then when you look at it, there are blood vessels in these. So even though the one we just looked at was empty, they're not really empty. they have blood vessels in them. Also, don't forget there are blood vessels that run this way, that connect these blood vessels. And again, those are called, perforating canals. So we have central canals and perforating canals. They both have blood vessels in them. Central canals, perforating canals. And then here's our osteon. So if you look at the osteon, there's our central canal. And then we've got these layers. So here's a layer, here's a layer, here's one, here's one, here's one. Those are all layers, and they're called lamellae. And then if you look here, there's where the holes are that the cells are located in. Well, on this part of the model over here, they left the cell in there so you could see what the cells look like. But here, you see what the holes look like. And remember, the holes are called lacunae. So there's our central canal, there's our lamellae, and here are somewhere. Well, there's the lacunae with the cells in it. Well, let's go back. So look, we have these lamellae. Well, there's actually 3 types of lamellae. There are the ones that go in circle within a circle within a circle. So a circle, inside a circle, inside a circle. And when you have circles inside circles, the math term for that is concentric. So these are called concentric lamellae. So these, circle, those are concentric lamellae, concentric lamellae, concentric lamellae. And if we look here, that's what this is. Those are concentric lamellae. So are these, so are these, so are these. These are concentric lamellae. But there's actually 2 other types of lamellae. Remember, this is the outside of the bone out here. And if you look here, the lamellae go all the way around the bone. They're not in a center. They're not in a circle around a central canal. They're on the outside of the bone. They're on the circumference of the bone. And so that's what they're called. They're called circumferential lamellae. Now they have 3 of these in this picture that are pulled up so you can see what they look like. But these others here are also concentric lamellae. And they run all the way around the bone. And then there's a 3rd type of lamellae, and they look like this. They're filler lamellae. So if we look here, that's a circle and a circle and a circle. But circles don't fit together. They have things that have to fill in between. Those are interstitial lamellae. So 3 types: concentric, circumferential, and interstitial. So when we look here, there's those concentric lamellae. So here's one layer, there's another layer, and another layer, and so on. But when you look at this one, not only does it show that, it shows the direction that the collagen fibers run. And just like over here, you can see that they run at different directions with each lamella. Same thing here. And then we have these concentric lamellae. They run in circles, but look over here, it's filler. It fills in the spaces between the circles. That's interstitial lamellae. And here, again, that's around the outside of the bone. That's circumferential lamellae. We also have these cells, and they're located in these little spaces called lacuna. And then we also have these little tiny canals that they extend their arms through. So there's the cell. These are osteocytes. Remember, osteocytes maintain bone. And then here's the space they're located in. That's the lacuna, or lacunae is plural. And then here's their little arms, and the arms extend through these little tiny spaces, and those again are called canaliculi. Sounds like can lick your eye. And then if you look on the model, there's our osteocyte. Well, here's our osteocyte. And you can see the little arms poking out like this, and here are these little arms poking out like this. So they tried to show you what these osteocytes looked like. And then there's the canaliculus right there. So here, where these are poking this way, they're going through a canaliculus. Not only did we see these hot, empty spaces over here, which were the lacunae, and then there were these osteocytes here, well, they also show them here. They show them stained over here. And when you look at them stained, you can see that they have these little arms. Again, those are those cytoplasmic extension. So the osteocytes are the cells of bone, these maintaining cells. And here's some right here. If we look at spongy bone, remember we don't have any osteons. Spongy bone doesn't look like this. That's dense bone, that's compact bone. So look, there's our central canal. There's our lamellae and all that around it. It's not like that over here. Look what the blood vessel does over here. It goes in between the bony spaces. So there's no tunnels over here. There are no canals. So we don't have central canals. We don't have perforating canals. There are no canals. And since there are no central canals, there are no osteons. So Zoe says, just to double check, osteogenic helps make the osteoblasts. So osteogenic refers to the layer. We'll get to it again in a minute, but it's a layer. And in that layer are osteoblasts and osteoclasts in the layer. So these make up this layer. Down in here, these trapped ones are osteocytes. So yes, you have all three types, actually 4 types in bone all together, all at the same time. Well, let's talk again some more about spongy bone. So here's spongy bone, and it looks like this. Remember, you can see it with your naked eye, and what it looks like is a bunch of little bitty ridges or struts or something. And those ridges or struts are called trabeculae. So if we blow it up, it looks like this. Those are those trabeculae. So these are spongy bone, little ridges. You can see it here in this bone, and in here, this bone. You can see the trabeculae in there. And this again is with your naked eye. You can also see it on the model. If you notice this, it looks like a honeycomb. And this honeycomb is spongy bone. It's this blown up. So that's this honeycomb. And again, the little ridges of the honeycomb are called trabeculae. And so when we look at the model, we see these ridges right here and right here and right here. These are those ridges. Those are the trabeculae. And then we see spaces in between them. And look, those arteries, those blood vessels run through those spaces. They run around the trabeculae. And so here are the trabeculae. And you can see how, again, it looks like a honeycomb. So we can see all those things that we were talking about. This is just a different view, but this is the inside view. Now over here, the wide part is the outside view. And then we went over the membranes of bone. Remember, there's a membrane around the outside, and there's a membrane around the inside. The one around the outside is called the periosteum. And remember, the periosteum has two layers. It has this thick outer layer, which is the fibrous layer. And then it has the layer right next to the bone, which is very, very thin. And it's got those cells in it. And then this periosteum is held onto the bone by these perforating fibers. So we looked at this picture in the lecture. And so here's the bone right here. This is the outside out here. And so there's the membrane right there and right there. Two layers. So there's a fibrous layer and an osteogenic layer. If we look on the model, you can see those two layers right here. There's one there, that's the outside, and there's this one, which is close to the bone. And then here are these little perforating fibers that are holding it on. If we blow it up, it looks like this. So this is the fibrous layer. This is the osteogenic layer. And then here are these fibers. If you look at it from the top, you can still see two layers. There's one right there and one right there. So this one is the osteogenic because it's the one closest to the bone. This one is the fibrous. It's the outer one. And then here you can see these perforating fibers holding it on. Don't forget over here, there's our lamellae and our central canals, our osteons. So it's on the outside of this bone. This is outside over here. And again, it looks like this. But not only do we have a periosteum, we also have this endosteum. And so that's this one right here. And look how it looks like a honeycomb, because what we're looking at it is it's on top of those trabeculae. It looks like a honeycomb. But it's not the bone, it's this thin layer, thin membrane covering it. And remember, it's only got one layer, which is the osteogenic layer. So Zoe, yes, they both have an osteogenic layer. And again, the osteogenic layer is where the osteoblasts are and where the osteoclasts are. So remember, we can make the bone bigger from the outside and smaller from the outside, but we can do the same thing from the inside. So if we look at the outside over here versus the inside over here, you can see this one has two layers, but this one only has one layer. The outside has a fibrous layer, which is this one, the outermost one. And it has this osteogenic layer, which is right next to the bone. But this one only has this one layer, which is right next to the bone. That's the osteogenic layer. But this is where osteoblasts are. And this is where osteoclasts are. Same thing over here. This is where osteoblasts are. and osteoclasts. Any questions? So if we look at this narrow end, this is the inside. So this is the narrow end. And again, there's our honeycomb-like structure. Well, this gray layer that you see on top of the honeycomb, on top of the bone, that is the endosteum. So this gray, this light blue, whatever color it is, that's the endosteum. Well, look, it wraps itself around the trabeculae. It's wrapped around like this. And it covers these trabeculae. This can make the trabeculae bigger, and we can make them smaller. Because again, we have osteoblasts and osteoclasts in this layer. Remember, osteoblasts build bone, osteoclasts destroy bone. So we can add bone, but we can also remove bone. Make sense? So we're back to this picture again. So the trabeculae are the bone itself. They're bony ridges. But the endosteum, remember, is a membrane. It's a membrane around, on top of these trabeculae. Anybody have any questions? So I think pretty much we covered everything that we covered this morning, but just basically pointing things out and talking about them a little bit. Anybody have any questions from this or from this morning? So this is the lab portion, and this is what the quiz will be over, the quiz from today.